We're back with the SIU's Head of Governance, Advocate Mahlodi Muofhe. He's joining us tonight, on Tonight with Jane Dutton. Advocate, before we went to the break, we're talking about the recovery of monies, and you're telling us about what a sterling job you've been able to do in cancelling contract and in recovering monies. One of the outstanding matters where money is concerned is that of Nkandla and, of course, the architect Minenhle Makhaya. In that particular case, 155 million rand that the SIU is yet to collect back from him. Where are we with that case?
Regrettably, we are still litigating in that case. You know, with civil matters, civil litigation, they take time. In some instances, parties correctly or incorrectly would ditch their legal representatives and engage new ones, and new ones coming in, correctly so, would have to start afresh in terms of reading, and those things take time. And, you know, the court role, you know, in civil litigation matters, you know, high court role, is generally clogged. But I can safely say that that matter is not swept under the carpet. We are litigating with the third person in that instance of Nkandla. And so we hope that because he has been changing his legal representatives at every turn, and it is his right to do so.
Very briefly, have you been able to establish whether or not he can actually afford that 155, that he still has the means to pay it back, very briefly?
I would imagine, Cathy, because, you know, and you know, as lawyers would always say, or people now would always say, you know, this matter is before the courts and we cannot talk about it. It's not easy for me to establish whether, and to say whether he's got the means or he doesn't, but all I can say is that we are litigating with him.
All right, let's leave it there for now. We've got Roy on the line from Cape Town. Good evening, Roy. What's your question?
Hi, Cathy. My question is, why do they constantly refer to the malfeasance as corruption, when in fact it's nothing less than pure theft? It's been theft, and it's been stealing for 24 years, ever since the ANC got into power, and nothing seems to happen. I have never seen a court case where somebody has been prosecuted for theft. Don't call it corruption, call it what it is. It's actually theft. And can your colleague who's in the studio at the moment tell us why we have never, ever seen or heard of court cases where people are brought to book? We hear about all the thieving, but we never see the results and the punishment that the people deserve. So I'd like to know why.
All right, Roy, thanks for that question. Advocate?
As the SIU, we are not the ones to duck from answering questions whenever we are asked to. Safe to say that the caller should direct his questions to the NPA, because in our case, once we have referred matters to the NPA, the matter that would have referred to the NPA gets out of our hand. So we wouldn't know what happens on the other side. And on the other side, it could well be that in their own thinking, they think the matter should be investigated further. But I think it would be unfair for me to speak on their behalf.
But do you think that then that takes part of your power away? The fact that you do all of this work and then you leave it in the hands of the NPA. And if I'm hearing you correctly, perhaps what the NPA decides to pursue in terms of criminal prosecution is not necessarily always the full advice of the SIU.
We are at a stage where, and I would imagine that it could have been happening even in the past, where our teams are beginning to work collaboratively now you know, our forensic investigators with the prosecutors at the NPA, so that we could get to understand what are the log jams there. Because it is true, of course, whether you call it malpractice, maladministration, or theft, the fact of the matter is it's just a question of semantics. The reality is malpractice or maladministration is unlawful in any case. And if maladministration it's supposed to be reportable as a criminal offense, that's what we do as the SIU.
But at the same time, it also takes you very long to complete the investigations that you're carrying out. You know, the Brian Hlongwa matter that we spoke about, that took about 7, 8 years to be completed. At least the president was handed the, you know, the full report in 2017. The Minenke Makhaya issue, that's been also sitting on the agenda for a couple of years. And on top of that, you're still investigating other cases such as Life Esidimeni, the monies that need to be recovered from the expenditure over Nelson Mandela's funeral.
Yeah, that's true. It is in the nature of any investigation, whether in our country or outside the country, if you are to do it thoroughly, you must do it properly. And we are not talking about change, you know. We're talking about serious monies, and to try and trace where the rand went to, how it all started. It's not a simple process. It involves having to talk with so many people. If investigating a department, you may well understand that you probably would have to talk to almost over 100 people there to try and get information even on oath. So it's not as simple as all that. You may have to get even external forensic support services to make sure that by the time when we give a report, our report is qualitatively sound.
Let's talk about the next probe that you'll be taking on, which is into the State Attorney's Office and some of the corruption that has been involved there.
Yes. If you take the State Attorney's proclamation, for example, South Africans generally, and I think for decades, for example, it has been generally widely known, and allegations after allegations that the State Attorney's Office is corrupt. And the President was correct to say, hey, this has been in the air for a very long time. He wants us to investigate whether, in fact, the State Attorney is corrupt or not. And if remedial actions must be taken, whether it be in the form of criminal prosecution or civil recovery, for example, through civil litigation. And it is not going to be an easy thing, you know, because it's not a simple matter of going and interrogating a person. We need the cooperation of even some of attorneys, advocates in private practice who have generally been making some of these allegations to come on board. And it's not an easy thing, because you may find that a whole lot of them are not even prepared to depose to any affidavits. But as the SIU, we've got to laboriously work and ensure that we dig deep up until we finally get to a report where we're able to say, indeed, there is maladministration. In some instances, some attorneys or advocates have got to be reported to their own institutions, your Bar Council, the Law Society, and even be criminally prosecuted.
All right. I want to try and squeeze in one more caller before we wrap this up. Joe, I understand you're calling us from Polokwane. Good evening.
Good evening.
What's your question, Joe?
My question is, we see a lot of talk about the fight against corruption. The question is, where is the political will? Because we see You know, we see the officials, everybody talk about corruption, but nothing is actually being done about it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Joe. All right, Joe. And certainly the sentiment expressed by Joe is one many South Africans can relate with, that we hear all of these reports and we see that you're doing investigations, but at the end of the day, nobody ever gets arrested. You know, nobody ever gets handcuffed and put behind jail. And I think that's what he's really pointing to.
But I'm sure South Africans now know that President Ramaphosa is hell-bent on rooting out corruption. He speaks about it all the time, and he says it must be rooted out. So there is that political will. Minister of Police, painstakingly all the time, he's out there showing that he wants to bring criminals to book. In fact, just to talk about that political will, there were a number of cash in transit heists, and let's face it, SAPS, through the political will, support of the minister, those things, we're beginning to see them getting squeezed. So I'm sure there is that political will.
All right, that's how we'll leave it for tonight. And certainly we'll take from what you've said, but we'll also read a lot into what you haven't said. I think it touches on a question I started off this interview with, and that, of course, is Advocate Mahlodi. He is with the Special Investigating Unit. Still ahead, he's the first African Vice President of the International Mathematical Union. We'll talk to Professor Loyiso Nonga next.